So this is the beginning of Chapter 2. Hopefully you just wrote your Chapter 1 quest and everything went well. Hopefully I am able to speak, but probably not. I'm at home with my poor missing tonsils. We're going to start talking about biogeochemical cycles. So there's 3 parts to the word, bio, geo, chemical, and it tells you exactly what we're talking about. The prefix bio always refers to living organisms. Geo refers to the earth. And chemical refers to chemical. It's not even really a prefix, just part of a word. So what we're going to talk about are cycles that involve chemicals on the earth and their effect on living organisms. That's the topic for this chapter. So you'll notice my couple of points at the top are some overarching ideas for this entire chapter. The main idea that we're going to focus on in this chapter is the cycling of matter. In Chapter 1, we focused on energy because we were focused on how much energy could be transferred from one trophic level to the next, and we talked about kilojoules. Here we're going to focus on matter, but I don't want us to forget energy. Talking about matter, we're going to talk about a few things specifically. We're going to talk about water, carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen. Is that the only matter that exists? Of course not. These are just the cycles that we're going to use as exemplars to show you how matter cycles on Earth and how this affects living organisms. Now, like I said, I don't want you to forget about energy because energy from the sun is the principal driving force within all these cycles. None of these cycles would work without energy, and energy would not be able to be passed on without matter. So what I want you to come away with as a main idea from this entire chapter is that we need both of these things. You cannot only have energy or you cannot only have matter. So let's talk about the sun, which is our energy input. If we removed the energy input on our planet, what would happen? And you might say, well, one thing that could happen, goodbye to photosynthesis. So you'll say, oh, well, that's affecting living organisms. That's not affecting just cycling of matter. But let's delve a little deeper. If I have less photosynthesis, then plants will not be using as much water. So if plants aren't using water, I've immediately disrupted the water cycle. If I have less photosynthesis, plants will use less CO2. There's an impact on carbon. If I have less photosynthesis, plants will use less phosphorus and nitrogen, which they absorb from soil to help build new structures. For example, phosphorus is part of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and nitrogen is part of an amino acid, which is the building block of a protein. So if I took away energy, I'm going to directly affect all of those cycles simply by removing energy. I'm of course going to affect living organisms, but I want you to see the link between living organisms and cycling of matter. Now let's take a look at the other side of the story, decomposers. Decomposers break down materials, so we're really talking about matter here, and return nutrients to the soil. So what if I had a ton of energy, the sun's okay, but I don't have decomposers breaking down materials, returning them to the soil. So my source of recycled matter is gone. The result? Nutrients would all be depleted, and there would be less photosynthesis. So notice how these two things were both effects. When I took away the sun, it was the primary effect. When I took away decomposers, it was the secondary effect, but the principle is the same. I cannot have energy and matter alone. I have to have them together. So we're going to start by talking about one cycle, Hopefully in today's class, we're just going to talk about some basic information about water, and we'll continue in the next block. Now, the first thing that we're going to talk about before we even talk about the water cycle, which you're probably fairly familiar with, is some basic ideas about the uses of water. Now, water makes up, depending on which organism we're talking about, anywhere from 70 to 99% of the body mass of a living thing. So, for example, those phytoplankton that we discussed in the pyramid of biomass, they're close to the 99%. Most of their body mass is water, whereas something like a human is considerably less. We're in the 80s. But all living things, and usually scientists hesitate to use the word all, but I don't have an example of something that doesn't have water, so I'm going to use the word all. All living things that are alive currently have water as part of their body mass. It is the major compound in living cells. So when things are alive, water is the main thing that is in their cells. You might remember in Science 10 learning about osmosis and how water will flow in and out of cells to try to keep concentrations balanced and equal between the inside and the outside of the cell. Water is necessary. It's necessary for things like concentration equilibrium, but it's necessary for so many other things. Digestion. For example, we learned about hydrolysis. Hydrolysis, where water breaks down large molecules like carbohydrates into smaller molecules that can be absorbed into your bloodstream. Water is required for transport. Don't forget, your blood is more than half water, and water is used to dissolve things and transport things around, like oxygen, like glucose. Water is used for cooling. Think about thermoregulation. Again, based on your blood, water can help modify the temperature of your body, making you hotter or colder. Water is also the place where a lot of reactions occur, and by that we're talking about solutions. Lots of chemical reactions will only occur if the compounds that are part of the reaction are dissolved in a solution. So we need to talk about how organisms might gain or lose water. In a minute, you're going to take a look at page 38 of your textbook. It's about a water budget. And you might think that that sounds silly. Budgets are supposed to be for money. But we can make a budget for anything as long as there is an input and an output. So on the left, we have gains, and on the right, we have losses. How do you gain water and how do you lose water? Well, there are a few basic ways that organisms gain water. Eating, drinking, absorbing. So this picture here is a little picture of your skin. And lastly, something called metabolic water. Now, you should recognize the picture that is there. It's an organelle. We talked about it at length in the first unit. This is a mitochondria. So in a mitochondrion, what happens? Cellular respiration. So what's the reaction for cellular respiration? Well, we know oxygen and glucose produce CO2 and water and energy. And look at this. Water. I just produced water in a metabolic reaction. So metabolic water is water that is produced by a reaction that's occurring inside the organism's cells. On the right for losses, we have evaporation as the first two. It could either be evaporation because of breathing. So every time you breathe, a little bit of water vapor comes out with your breath. You can prove that because when it's really cold in the winter, the water vapor condenses immediately when it leaves your mouth. We also have sweating, which would be a way to lose water. And then we have urine and feces. as the two other ways that organisms lose water. And what you'll see when you take a look at the example of a water budget on page 38 is that the proportion that each of these factors contributes to the water budget is different depending on what type of environment the organism lives in. I'm going to highlight in particular this idea of metabolic water because it's based on something that you know about. It's a little bit fancier than the other ones, and it's definitely one that would make a difference between organisms that have lots of water available to them to drink and organisms that maybe live somewhere where water is not as readily available.